He was told to fire the old man to save a few $1,000s. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that in 60 seconds, this janitor would hold up a mirror to his soul, and he would not like the monster staring back. Arthur Vance, a man worth over $50 million, stood frozen, a termination letter gripped in his sweating hand. His board had ordered him to eliminate the night janitor, Elias Thorne. He's 72. He's a cost. It's just business, they said. But as Arthur watched the old man's slow, painful movements, the weight of his own emptiness crashed down. This wasn't a business decision. It was a sin, and life was about to demand a brutal payment. The air in the skyscraper's after-hours silence was thick, heavy with the scent of lemon-scented cleaner and quiet desperation. Below, the city glittered, a kingdom he commanded. But here, in this sterile hallway, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic swish of the mop. Each pass of the worn fibers across the linoleum seemed to erase something in Arthur, too. His custom-tailored suit felt like a costume. His Rolex, a shackle. He was about to destroy a man's livelihood, his ability to put food on his table, to marginally improve a quarterly report he'd already beaten. The cold, spreadsheet logic of it suddenly felt grotesque. The injustice was so plain, so visceral, it turned his stomach. He had spent his life climbing to the top of the corporate ladder, sacrificing everything to get there, only to find it leaning against the wrong damn wall. Now, I need you to do something for me. Take 1 second and type where you are watching from in the comments below. It's incredible to see this community come together from all over the world. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because what happened in that quiet hallway, between the millionaire and the man he was sent to destroy, was just the first crack in the glass, and the shockwave is coming. Arthur Vance stood frozen for a long moment, just watching. The only sound in the massive office was the soft swish of the mop and the hum of distant computers. This was his building, filled with his employees, but right now he felt like a stranger in his own home. He finally made himself walk forward, his expensive dress shoes clicking too loud on the clean floor. The old janitor, Elias, moved with a slow, steady rhythm that seemed out of place in their fast-paced world. His back was permanently bent from years of work, and his hands gripping the mop were rough and covered with veins. He worked steadily, quietly, like a ghost maintaining a machine he'd never truly be part of. Then Arthur noticed something odd. Taped to the janitor's cleaning cart was a small, faded photo in a simple frame. It showed a beautiful old building that looked like something from another century, maybe a library or museum. The photo stood out sharply against the plain cleaning supplies around it. Why would a janitor carrying a photo of a fancy old building? What did it mean to him? This small mystery caught Arthur off guard. He'd come here to fire a simple old man, but now he was facing someone with a history, with secrets. The termination letter in his hand suddenly felt heavy and wrong. This wasn't going to be as simple as he'd thought. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the quiet office like a gunshot. He held up the white envelope, trying to project the same cool authority he used in boardrooms. "Elias," he said, his voice tighter than he intended. "We're implementing some structural changes. I'm afraid we have to let you go." The old janitor slowly straightened up, his movements careful and deliberate. When he turned, his eyes, a surprisingly clear, calm blue, met Arthur's directly. There wasn't any of the fear or panic Arthur had braced himself for. Instead, Elias looked at him with a deep, weary understanding that was somehow much harder to face. "The number's not adding up, Mr. Vance," Elias asked. His voice had the rough texture of stone, but his tone remained gentle. The question caught Arthur completely off guard. He'd prepared for pleading, for anger, maybe even for tears. He hadn't prepared for this quiet challenge that went straight to the heart of the matter. For the first time in years, Arthur Vance found himself at a loss for words. The polished corporate phrases he'd rehearsed suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. He finally managed to speak, the words sounding defensive even to his own ears. "This isn't personal, you understand. It's strictly a business decision." A small, sad smile touched Elias's weathered face. "It's always personal, son," he said softly. "Especially when you're trying to erase the person you once were." The words landed not as an insult, but as a simple, devastating truth that seemed to echo in the silent space between them. Arthur felt something shift inside him. a crack appearing in the foundation of everything he thought he knew about himself and the world he'd built. Before Arthur could process the old man's words or form any kind of response, something even more unexpected happened. Elias's eyes flickered toward the large clock on the far wall. The time was exactly 9:17 p.m. Without another word, without even a glance in Arthur's direction, the old man turned his back on the millionaire. Arthur stood there, frozen, the termination letter still extended uselessly in the air between them. He'd been completely dismissed, his presence, his authority, the entire conversation forgotten. He watched, stunned into silence, as Elias walked slowly but purposefully toward the massive window that looked out over the city's glittering skyline. The old man didn't pull out a phone or check a watch. He simply stood there, his worn hands resting at his sides, his posture straightening as much as his aged frame would allow. He remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the eastern horizon with an intensity that seemed to shut out the entire world. For one full minute, the only sound was Arthur's own rapid heartbeat pounding in his ears. The modern office, the financial reports waiting on his desk, the board's demands, everything faded into insignificance. In this suspended moment, Arthur realized he was witnessing something sacred, something far more important than the corporate drama he'd brought into this space. He was an intruder in someone else's private ritual. When the minute passed, Elias took a slow, deep breath, his shoulders relaxing almost imperceptibly. He turned back to his cleaning cart as if nothing unusual had occurred, picking up his mop with the same deliberate care he'd shown before. Arthur finally lowered the envelope, his mind racing with questions. Who was this man who observed silent rituals while facing unemployment? What memory, what person, what promise was so important that it demanded this daily moment of reverence at exactly 9:17 p.m.? The firing no longer mattered. Understanding the mystery of Elias Thorne had become the only thing that mattered. Arthur stood completely still, the termination letter hanging limply from his fingers. The office was silent again except for the soft swish of Elias's mop, but Arthur couldn't move. The old man's words, trying to erase the person you once were, echoed in his mind, stirring up memories he had deliberately buried for decades. Suddenly, he was 9 years old again, sitting at a scarred wooden table in the small public library of his working-class neighborhood. The air smelled of old books and the lemon oil they used to polish the wooden shelves. He could almost feel the weight of his worn backpack and hear the quiet turning of pages around him. Mrs. Gable, the librarian with her kind eyes and endless patience, would always save new adventure books for him. "I thought you might like this one, Arthur," she'd whisper, her eyes twinkling. "It's about explorers." That library had been his sanctuary, a place where a boy from a struggling family could dream of bigger things. It was where he first imagined becoming successful, where he discovered worlds beyond his own. But as he climbed the corporate ladder, he had deliberately left that boy behind. He had buried those memories, embarrassed by his humble beginnings. Now this janitor, with his quiet dignity and mysterious ritual, had somehow reached deep into Arthur's past and pulled that forgotten boy back to the surface. Why did this stranger's presence affect him so deeply? What was the connection between this elderly janitor and the childhood memories Arthur had worked so hard to forget? Arthur stood there for several long moments, the crisp white envelope now damp and wrinkled in his sweating palm. He knew with sudden clarity that he couldn't go through with the termination. Not tonight. Not until he understood what was really happening here. We'll continue this discussion tomorrow," he finally managed to say, his voice uncharacteristically unsteady. He turned and walked quickly toward the elevators, his expensive shoes making too much noise in the quiet hallway. When the elevator doors slid open, he stepped inside but didn't press the button for his penthouse office suite. Instead, he rode down to the empty main lobby, his mind racing with questions about the mysterious old man. He pushed through the heavy glass doors and walked into the cool night air, the city lights glittering around him. His sleek black Mercedes sat waiting in the reserved CEO parking spot, but he didn't drive home to his luxurious apartment. Instead, he started the car and moved it to a dark, shadowed corner of the parking lot where he could still clearly see the building's main entrance. He turned off the engine and settled in to wait, the leather seat creaking as he adjusted his position. He needed to know where Elias went after work, what his life looked like outside these office walls. He needed to understand the man who carried a mysterious photograph and observed a silent ritual every night at exactly 9:17. Arthur Vance, a man who usually commanded situations and had all the answers, was now consumed with questions. He was about to follow a 72-year-old janitor, and some deep instinct told him this might be the most important investigation of his entire life. Arthur watched from the shadows of his Mercedes as Elias finally emerged from the office building. The old man moved with the same deliberate pace Arthur had observed earlier, not hurried or weary, but steady and purposeful. He watched as Elias walked to a beat-up bicycle locked to a street sign and began his journey home. Arthur put his car in gear and began to follow at a careful distance, leaving the glittering canyon of skyscrapers behind. The transition was stark and unsettling. The smooth, wide avenues of the business district gave way to narrower streets with cracked pavement. The bright, sterile light from office windows was replaced by the flickering orange glow of old streetlights. He passed boarded-up storefronts and check-cashing places, their neon signs buzzing in the night. The air, once filtered and clean, now carried the faint smells of fried food and exhaust. This was a part of the city Arthur only knew from economic reports and demographic charts, a line item labeled Urban Revitalization Potential. Now he was driving through it, following a man he was supposed to fire into a world that felt a million miles away from his own. He rolled up his window, not just for the air, but as an instinctive barrier, realizing he was an outsider here, a tourist in someone else's reality. The journey felt like a descent, not in distance, but in understanding, and with every block, the weight of the termination letter in his pocket seemed to grow heavier. After 10 minutes of navigating the tired streets, Arthur saw Elias slow down. The old man leaned his bike against a rusted fence in front of a building that looked like it had given up hope long ago. The structure was 2 stories of faded red brick, several of its windows patched with plywood. A worn, barely legible sign above the door read, Maple Street Community Center. Arthur parked his car a discreet distance away, the Mercedes looking like a spaceship that had landed on the wrong planet. He stepped out into the quiet street, the sound of his car door closing echoing too loudly. He watched as Elias unlocked the front door and disappeared inside. A moment later, a soft, warm light flickered on in one of the ground floor windows. Arthur moved closer, stepping carefully over the uneven sidewalk. His heart was pounding, not from fear, but from a growing, undeniable sense that he was about to witness something that would change everything. He crept toward the lit window, the grimy glass obscuring his view. He wiped a small circle clean with his sleeve, his breath catching in his throat. Peering inside, he saw Elias, but the man was transformed. This was no longer the quiet janitor from the office. This was someone else entirely. And the scene unfolding in that dilapidated room was about to shatter Arthur Vance's world forever. Arthur stared, his face just inches from the grimy glass, his mind struggling to process the scene before him. The dim, dusty room of the community center had been transformed. In the center, sitting on worn carpets and mismatched chairs, was a circle of about 10 children, their faces lit with rapt attention. And standing before them, holding an open book with the same care Arthur had seen him hold a mop, was Elias. But he wasn't the silent, invisible worker from the office. His posture was straight, his eyes bright and animated. He was reading to them, his rough voice now a warm, expressive instrument, bringing the story to life with different voices for each character. The children were utterly captivated, their eyes wide, one little girl hugging a tattered teddy bear as she listened. Then Arthur's gaze drifted to the wall behind them, and his blood ran cold. There, hanging where everyone in the room could see it, was a larger, clearer version of the photograph taped to Elias's janitorial cart. It showed the grand, beautiful old building in its prime, the Cedar Heights Public Library. A library Arthur remembered visiting as a child. A library that had been shut down due to city budget cuts nearly 15 years ago. The truth crashed over him with the force of a physical blow. Elias wasn't just a janitor. He was Mr. Thorne, the head librarian. The city cut his funding, his life's work, and to stay close to the books he loved, he took the only job left in the building, cleaning it at night. Arthur had been sent to fire a librarian. The 9:17 ritual? The library's final closing time. He was remembering his life's purpose every single night. Arthur stepped back from the window, his legs weak, the world tilting on its axis. Arthur stood outside the community center, his mind reeling. The cool night air did nothing to calm the feverish heat of shame spreading through his body. The image of Elias, no, Mr. Thorne, surrounded by those eager children was burned into his mind. He had to go in. He couldn't just drive away. The polished leather of his steering wheel felt alien under his touch, a symbol of a life that now felt hollow and cruel. He pushed the heavy, creaking door open and stepped inside. The air in the center was warm and carried the faint, sweet smell of old books and cheap crayons. The children, their reading session finished, were now drawing at a small table in the corner. They looked up as the stranger in the expensive suit entered, their curious eyes taking him in. Elias was carefully placing books back on a makeshift shelf, his back to the door. He turned slowly, and seeing Arthur, he showed no surprise. There was no anger in his gaze, only that same deep, weary understanding from the office, now magnified 1,000 times in this context. "Mr. Vance," Elias said, his voice calm. "I wondered if you'd find your way here." Arthur's corporate eloquence deserted him. All his prepared speeches, his justifications, evaporated. He could only gesture weakly, his words a stammer. The library. You were the librarian." "I was," Elias replied, his eyes drifting to the children. "I still am, in the ways that matter. A building doesn't make a library. A thirst for knowledge does." He looked back at Arthur, his gaze piercing. "Why are you here, Arthur? You didn't come to fire me again." "Not here." Arthur felt naked, exposed. This man could see straight through the armor of his suit and his wealth. I didn't know," was all he could manage, the words feeling pathetic and insufficient. "People rarely do," Elias said softly, not with accusation, but with a profound sadness that was somehow worse. "We see the uniform, not the man wearing it. We see the cost, not the value." He took a step closer, his voice dropping, meant only for Arthur. "You have spent your life building a fortress of money and power, Arthur. But who is it meant to keep out? The world? Or the man you were afraid you still are?" The question hung in the air, a verdict waiting to be delivered. The silence in the community center was absolute, broken only by the soft scratching of crayons on paper. Arthur Vance, a man who debated billion-dollar deals, found himself utterly disarmed by a retired librarian's quiet question. He looked around the shabby room, at the water-stained ceiling, the shelves of donated books, the faces of children who found magic in this crumbling place. He thought of his own sterile office, his penthouse, his portfolio. He had more wealth than he could ever spend, yet in that moment, he felt a poverty of the soul so acute it was physically painful. Elias stood patiently, waiting, as if he had seen this internal collapse many times before in people who mistook net worth for self-worth. Arthur finally found his voice, though it was raw and unsteady. "What do I do?" he asked, the question stripped of all pretense. It was the plea of a lost man, not the command of a CEO. Elias studied him for a long moment, his sharp, intelligent eyes seeming to weigh the sincerity of Arthur's broken pride. The simple, life-altering truth he was about to offer required the recipient to be truly ready to hear it. He saw that Arthur, for the first time in decades, was the measure of a life, Elias said, his voice clear and firm, carrying through the quiet room, is not in what you acquire, but in what you restore. The 7 words landed in Arthur's heart with the weight of a lifetime's wisdom. What you restore. They dismantled his entire worldview in a single, graceful blow. Success wasn't about accumulation, it was about contribution. Power wasn't about control, it was about empowerment. He had spent his life taking, building, acquiring, climbing over people like Elias to get to the top. He looked at the children, at this man who had lost everything and yet had found a way to restore a tiny piece of it for them. Arthur Vance had never built anything half as meaningful as this dilapidated sanctuary. The path forward, terrifying and uncertain, suddenly became clear. He wasn't just there to apologize. He was there to begin. The next morning, Arthur Vance walked into the boardroom a changed man. The air, usually charged with the scent of ambition and expensive coffee, now felt thin and suffocating. The polished mahogany table, a symbol of his authority, seemed like an altar to a god he no longer believed in. His board members, a collection of sharp suits and sharper minds, waited with expectant ease, assuming the night janitor had been efficiently handled. Arthur didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, his knuckles resting on the cool wood, and began to speak. He didn't talk about profit margins or shareholder value. He told them a story. He spoke of an old librarian, a forgotten community center, and children whose only access to books came from a man they had labeled a cost. He described the 9:17 p.m. ritual, not as a quirk, but as a testament to dedication. Then he presented his new proposal, the Elias Thorne Foundation, a multi-million-dollar initiative to fund literacy programs, rebuild community libraries, and formally reinstate the janitorial staff with full benefits and a living wage. The silence that followed was more hostile than any outburst. Then, the storm broke. "Arthur, this is insanity," snapped Victoria Cross, the lead investor. "Sentiment is not a revenue stream. We are a corporation, not a charity." Another board member, Mark, chimed in, his tone dripping with condescension. "You want to take capital and pour it into a money pit based on what? A emotional whim? This isn't the man we built this company with." They attacked the proposal with cold, relentless logic. They presented spreadsheets that showed the opportunity cost, the negative ROI, and the investor panic such a move would cause. They weren't just rejecting his idea, they were rejecting the very values he now clung to. The battle lines were drawn not over money, but over the soul of the enterprise. Arthur fought back, his voice rising with a passion they had never seen, but he was outnumbered and outgunned by the very system he had created. The meeting ended with a chilling ultimatum, delivered with a veneer of corporate politeness. "Drop this, Arthur. Refocus on our core business, or the board will be forced to take a vote of no confidence in your leadership." He had built this kingdom, and now it was threatening to exile its king for showing a heart. Back in the stark isolation of his corner office, the board's ultimatum echoed in the silence. The city sprawled beneath him, a glittering monument to the success he was being ordered to betray. Drop this or be removed. The choice was impossibly stark. On one side was everything he had ever worked for. His title, his power, his $50 million net worth, the entire identity of Arthur Vance, self-made millionaire. It was the life he knew, the language he spoke, the validation he had craved since he was that 9-year-old boy in the library. To walk away was to become a ghost in this world he had dominated. It meant ridicule, financial uncertainty, and the terrifying question of who he was without the business card. On the other side was a dusty community center and 7 words from an old man. "The measure of a life is what you restore." It was a future with no blueprint, no guarantee, built on faith instead of spreadsheets. It meant facing the shame of his past decisions and starting over. But it also meant a chance at redemption. It meant looking at himself in the mirror and not seeing the monster Elias had held up to him. He thought of the children's faces, lit by the power of a story. He thought of Elias, who had lost his library but never his purpose. Their world had a truth his corner office lacked. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, a physical agony. This was no longer a corporate strategy. It was a choice between two selves. Would he remain the ruthless CEO, protecting his fortress of wealth? Or would he dare to become the man Mrs. Gable the librarian had once believed he could be? The man Elias Thorne now saw flickering within him? His entire life had been a climb to the top, but only now, perched on this precipice, did he realize the most important step wasn't upward, but inward, and it required letting go. The drive back to Maple Street felt different this time. The gleaming skyscrapers of downtown, which had always filled Arthur with a sense of power and belonging, now looked like a cage made of glass and steel. The board's ultimatum echoed in his mind, a stark choice between the life he had built and the man he was beginning to understand he needed to become. He didn't park discreetly today. He pulled his Mercedes right up to the cracked curb in front of the community center and killed the engine, the sudden silence feeling more profound than any boardroom hush. He walked directly to the familiar window, the grimy glass now feeling like a lens into a world that held more truth than any financial report. Inside, the afternoon sun cut through the dust motes dancing in the air, casting a golden hue over a scene that stopped Arthur's breath. Elias was there, of course, but he wasn't alone. He was kneeling beside a small boy, their heads bent over a picture book. Arthur watched, utterly transfixed. This was the third ghost, not of Christmas past or future, but of a present he had systematically excluded from his own life. He saw the incredible patience in Elias's posture, the way his gnarled finger carefully traced beneath each word. He saw the moment of struggle on the boy's face, the furrowed brow, the sound of a difficult word being sounded out slowly. And then he saw the breakthrough, the sudden spark of understanding in the child's eyes, the triumphant smile that erupted, and the gentle, affirming nod from Elias. This was it. This was the real economy, the one that mattered. This was value being created in its purest form, knowledge being passed, confidence being built, a future being quietly, patiently forged. The staggering sums of money, the threatening ultimatums, the potential loss of his entire fortune. It all suddenly seemed so small, so insignificant against this single, perfect moment of human connection. The fear that had been a cold knot in his stomach began to dissolve, replaced by a warm, resolute clarity that flowed through him like a drug. He wasn't here to hide from his problems. He was here to find his solution. The path forward, though terrifying, was now illuminated. It led directly away from everything he owned, and directly toward everything that mattered. The emergency board meeting was convened with ruthless efficiency just 2 hours later. The atmosphere in the opulent room was thick with tension and the unspoken scent of a corporate coup. Arthur walked in, but he carried himself differently. The defensive posture from the previous day was gone, replaced by a calm, almost serene stillness that seemed to unnerve the assembled members more than any outburst could have. He took his seat at the head of the table, the very seat that symbolized his authority, and listened patiently as Victoria Cross stood and delivered a meticulously prepared indictment of his recent, erratic, and emotionally driven behavior. She cited the detrimental and fiscally irresponsible proposal for the Elias Thorne Foundation, framing it as a betrayal of their fiduciary duty to the shareholders. She finished with a cold, surgical strike. "The floor is yours, Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with faux politeness. "We await your resignation." The room fell into a dead silence, every eye fixed on him, waiting for the expected fight, the desperate plea, the political maneuvering. They were armed for a corporate war. They were completely unprepared for a surrender that would become a victory. Arthur did not stand. He simply leaned forward, his hands folded calmly on the table, and swept his gaze across each of their faces. "I'm not resigning," he stated, his voice even and clear. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the room. Victoria's lips tightened. "Then we have no choice but to call for an immediate vote of no confidence," she declared, reaching for the buzzer to summon the rest of the board. Arthur held up a single hand, a simple gesture that somehow commanded the room to stillness. "You misunderstand," he said, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I'm not resigning from my principles. I am, however, tendering my immediate resignation as CEO of this company." The gasps this time were audible. He continued, not giving them a moment to recover. "And upon my departure, I will be liquidating 51% of my personal stake in this company's stock. Every single dollar of that capital will be used to establish and fully endow the Elias Thorne Foundation." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of shock. They had prepared for a battle over the throne. He had simply set the entire castle on fire and walked away, taking the real treasure with him. He had chosen the crumbling community center over the penthouse corner office. He had chosen the act of restoration over the endless cycle of acquisition. He stood up, not as a defeated executive, but as a man who had finally found his true currency. "This company was built on the idea of creating value," he said, his voice resonating with a newfound conviction. "Somewhere along the way, I confused the scoreboard for the game. I'm leaving to go remember how to play." And with that, Arthur Vance turned his back on the multi-million-dollar empire he had built and walked out of the boardroom and into his new life, leaving nothing but a stunned silence and the echo of a lesson they could never understand in his wake. 1 week later, Arthur found himself standing once more outside the Maple Street Community Center. This time, there was no hesitation, no shadowed car, no peering through dirty windows. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, the familiar scent of old books and crayons welcoming him like an old friend. The space was buzzing with more energy than he'd seen before. A local news crew was packing up their equipment, having just covered the story of the newly formed foundation. A few volunteers were sorting through boxes of brand new books that had already started arriving from early donors. And in the center of it all was Elias, not as a janitor or even just a teacher, but as the calm, steady heart of the entire operation. Arthur waited until the old man had a quiet moment, then approached him. He was dressed in simple, comfortable clothes, a world away from his former CEO uniform. "Elias," he began, his voice filled with a respect that was now completely genuine. He didn't reach for a wallet or a checkbook. Instead, he held out a simple, formal-looking letter. "I'm not here to offer you a job. I'm here to ask for your help." Elias took the letter, his wise eyes scanning the contents. It was a formal invitation on the letterhead of the Elias Thorne Foundation, requesting his presence as the founding chairman of the board. The old man's eyes widened slightly, then softened. He looked from the letter to Arthur's face, seeing not a benefactor, but a partner. "You don't need to pay me," Elias said quietly. Arthur shook his head, a genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. "I'm not offering payment. I'm asking for your wisdom. The foundation has money. What it needs is its soul. And that's you." In that moment, the circle was complete. The man who had come to fire was now asking to be led, and the man who was nearly fired held the keys to a future brighter than either of them had ever imagined. Months passed. The story of the millionaire and the janitor became the stuff of local legend, then national news. But for Arthur and Elias, the real work happened far from the spotlight, in the newly renovated community center that now bore a fresh, proud sign: the Elias Thorne Literacy Center. The grand opening was a vibrant, joyful chaos. The air was filled with the sounds of children laughing and the rustle of new book pages. The walls, once bare and stained, were now lined with overflowing bookshelves and colorful artwork. In the heart of the main room, surrounded by a captivated circle of children, sat Arthur Vance. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was on a comfortable rug, holding a picture book, doing voices for the characters as the children giggled in delight. He looked happier, more at peace, than he had in decades. His wealth was now a tool, not a trophy. As he read, he glanced across the room and saw Elias watching him, a quiet, proud smile on the old man's face. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward 9:17 p.m. When the moment arrived, Arthur didn't stop reading. But he did pause, just for a second, and his eyes met Elias's from across the busy room. It was a new ritual, a silent, shared acknowledgement that passed between them. No longer a moment of grief for what was lost, but a quiet celebration of what had been restored. They were no longer a millionaire and a janitor. They were partners, friends, and guardians of a promise that every child who walked through their doors would have a place to dream, just as a young boy named Arthur once had in a library long ago. The measure of their lives was no longer in bank statements, but in the small, triumphant moments of a child finally understanding a word, in the quiet hum of a place that had become a sanctuary, and in the unbreakable bond between two men who had saved each other in ways nobody could have ever seen coming. So here we are, at the end of our story, but really, at the beginning of a much more important conversation. Arthur Vance lost his corporate title, but found his purpose. He sacrificed millions of dollars, but gained something no amount of money could ever buy: a clear conscience and a meaningful life. He walked away from a kingdom built on spreadsheets and returned to his simple library, the very place where his dreams had first begun, completing a circle that had been broken for decades. On the surface, this is a tale of incredible redemption, of a wealthy man who finally saw the light. But I want to leave you with one final thought, one open-ended question that I want you to really sit with. We all watched Arthur's transformation, his painful but necessary sacrifice. But here's the question that truly matters, the one that separates a nice story from a life-changing lesson. Did Arthur change because he discovered his conscience was bankrupt, or because Elias gave him the one thing his fortune never could, a real chance to pay a moral debt he didn't even know he owed? Was he running toward a new purpose, or was he finally running away from the hollow man he had become? Think about that. Think about the debts we all carry, not in our bank accounts, but in our souls. Arthur found a way to settle his. His story ends here, but yours is still being written. What will you restore?